All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bonnie Swager. I'm the Associate Director of RIT Libraries, and I'd like to welcome you to our panel discussion about selecting and assessing publishers. First, I'd like to thank Francis Androw, Nick Paulus, and Greg Decker for organizing this from the Metadata and Digital Scholarship Support Department. And they were the ones who brought in our wonderful speakers today. This is actually the latest in an ongoing series of events that explore the ways in which scholarly communication has been changing over the last 20 years. So if you like today's discussion, stay tuned. Next year we'll do more on this topic. And if you feel the need to share what's being talked about today or ask any questions, you can see the Twitter hashtag RIT Scholarship right up there on the board. You can follow along there. Today's panelists are outstanding guides to this increasingly complex publishing landscape. They have extensive experience authoring scholarly papers and editing scholarly journals. They have a deep knowledge about publishing issues related to copyright, open access, journal metrics. Importantly, they pay close attention to the world of scholarly publishing in order to assist other scholars who are trying to make the best decisions about sharing their own work. Our first speaker today will be Amanda Page. She's the Open Publishing and Collections Librarian at Syracuse University. In this role, she wears many hats, including support for the institutional repository, open access publishing workflows, author addenda, and rights and permissions. Her everyday work includes topics like publishing ethics, open access, support for authors, quality assessment, publication agreement, and author rights. Her work focuses on fostering quality open access, policy development, education, and support for authors and their voices. Our next speaker, did you guys rearrange yourselves? No.
Follow the pictures.
All right. Our next speaker will be Ilka Datig. She's the head of instruction and outreach at Nazareth College's Lorette Wilmot Library. She's an MLIS from Syracuse University and an MA in cultural anthropology from New York University. She's published and presented on a number of topics, including intellectual property and scholarly publishing, user experience design, and ethnographic research methods in libraries. Jim DelRosso is an associate librarian and the digital projects coordinator for Cornell University's Hospitality, Labor, and Management Library. He provides scholarly communication support to several academic communities at Cornell and manages 2 open access digital repositories, the Scholarly Commons, serving Cornell's School of Hotel Administration, and Digital Commons at ILR, which serves the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. As such, he has spent years exploring publishers and their policies to better advise scholars as they decide where and how to publish their work. And last, we'll have Maggie Kearney, who has served as the associate editor for 2 journals before becoming the editor-in-chief of Research in Nursing and Health in 2012, a position she held until early this year. She has published more than 100 articles, 38 of them on writing and publishing. As the Vice Provost and University Dean of Graduate Studies at the University of Rochester, Maggie oversees doctoral studies across the university and is a professor in the School of Nursing. Each of the presenters have a brief presentation for us. I'll ask the audience to hold questions until they've all finished, and then we'll have some time for in-depth questions and answers with our whole panel. So, Amanda.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming, and thanks to RIT and everyone for having me. So, just an FYI, we're trying a little bit of a new setup here, so please bear with me as I'm the first presentation. So, I'm here to talk today about quality in open access. So, without further ado, let's start. So today I'll talk briefly about some of my thoughts and experiences over my career. I woke up and I thought, oh my gosh, I have been doing this for quite some time. I was thinking about the history of the developments in ScholComm and how things have changed, and I realized that I've been doing this much longer than I realized. I'll talk about indicators of how to gauge and evaluate quality, and then I'm going to leave you with a few tips and takeaways. So a few thoughts and experiences. Little Red Riding Hood was afraid of a wolf, right? So a quick story. Today's 2018. A few years ago, I was at the institution where I was working at that time in the staff lounge, very early in the morning, getting my morning cup of coffee at this place. A lot of different people and affiliates of the institution would come in and talk in the morning, and it would be lively conversation. And that particular day in 2013, this faculty PI said, "Hey, Amanda, how's it going? What about that John Bohannon article about predatory publishing? What do you think?" It turns out that, if you haven't read it already, John Bohannon did a study in 2013. It wasn't the first of its kind, but he looked at and published in Science a study on predatory open access journals. In my personal opinion, it wasn't a controlled study because it only looked at open access publications, and it didn't have a controlled subscription-based conventional publication experiment facet. But that day, I hadn't read that article yet when I was getting my cup of coffee. And so it spurred on a conversation between this PI and myself. And the PI was supportive of open access, but I'm bringing this to your attention because today we're in 2018, and in 2013 there was a lot of support for open access, and OA was by no means new. When I started this work, it was in the early aughts, mid-aughts, and when I began, more of the questions were, what is open access? Is it quality? What is predatory? Oh, I don't really like open access because it's all predatory. 2013, more of the questions were, I like open access, but I'm not sure how to gauge the quality. Today, the conversation has moved even farther ahead. So, without that, I want to remind you that it's not about if it's predatory or not. In regards to open access publications and conventional publications, the way that I like to think about it is it ethical publishing or is it unethical? Yeah, it's just applicable to all different types of publications. So a few measures of how to indicate and evaluate quality. A few of the ones that may be markers of high quality include our ethical publishing guidelines and standards like COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, or other standards that are relevant to the discipline followed by the publisher and journal. Does the publication contract be very supportive of author rights and self-archiving rights in green open access repositories? Does it allow for a lot of versions to be deposited in open access repositories? And are there short or no embargoes applicable? Are the publishers members of the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association? Do they care about having affordable, realistic article processing charges? And if they're book publishers, are the book processing charges affordable to the everyday scholar? Are the journals fully open access journals, or are they hybrid? Next slide, please. Do the publishers value indexing, whether that's in the Directory of Open Access Journals, PubMed, EBSCO, relative databases that are applicable to the discipline of the publication? Also, if it is an open access journal, a marker of even more in-depth high quality would be if it has the DOAJ seal, which means it's even more high quality. Also, does the publisher have things going on the back end in terms of technical wherewithal, including DOIs, PERMA-CC, they care about consistent URLs, ISSNs, ISBNs, and the like. Also, do the publishers care about archiving and preservation and accessibility standards? So, if the journal crashes, if the site and the servers crash, will that content be preserved long time because there are backup measures in place? In terms of accessibility, does that journal publisher really truly care about access to information for all all types of readers, all types of people, and do they adhere to the most current WCAG AA 2.0 standards? Lastly, do the publishers and the journals support funder and open access institutional policy support? That could include university policies that assist with open access policies, data management policies, federal mandates or corporate mandates for public access to taxpayer-funded research, and proactive publisher deposit into trusted repositories. So, for example, does this publisher or journal that you like, does it do the deposit for you? Or does this publisher say, hey, author, you must do the deposit yourself? A few negative ones. There's no journal information on the website, or the website is broken. In the same issue, the editors are repetitive or highly numerous. Peer review is paid. Now, this is a little bit of a controversial one. Some people think that it's okay for peer review to be paid, and others say, if a journal is paying for peer review, what does that mean, and how ethical is that? Also, if a publisher does direct frontline marketing to authors or editors, sometimes that's a marker of questionable ethics. Are the author guidelines, scope, and aims thorough and available for people to read? If they are not available, then that's a marker of negative quality. If an embargo for green open access to versions is highly lengthy, so for example, in my personal opinion, anything that's greater than 18 months, 24 months, 48 months, or longer, that's a sign that the publisher may not care about the authors as much as other publishers that have shorter embargoes, such as 12 or 18 months. The self-archiving rights and the versions that are permitted for green open access are minimal to non-existent. APCs and BPCs are so cost prohibitive that gold open access is not achievable. So a few quick takeaways before I pass on the presentation. I encourage you that at the point that you have an idea mulling around in your head, do some research and reach out to your librarians or your editors at journals that you like and find out information relating to the information that I've given you. Remember that not all new journals are unethical. It could be that the editor or the publication or the press is just young and learning. So therefore, I would say it all goes down to the content. What do you think about the content and the publications that are published? Is it really worth your time? Are these materials written by scholars that you appreciate and value? Is it high quality writing? So, right now I want to encourage you to empower yourself and to challenge yourself to ask a few questions. What are the top 3 to 5 journals that you normally publish in? Where do they fall in terms of your personal motivations and your own personal professional ethics? So do they match your professional ethics, or are they not quite a good fit? And perhaps should you find other journals to publish in so that when you publish and you submit, they match your professional motivations so that you're all in line with each other? That's all. Again, I thank you for your time, and now I'm passing on.
So hello, everyone. Yes, that's right. So my name is Ilka Datig, and I am a librarian at Nazareth College. And so I'm going to build on a few of the things that Amanda just mentioned. So she paid a lot of attention to markers of quality, and I thought it would be fun to look at some of the not markers of unquality, but some of the things that you don't want to see. And I'm using examples from direct marketing to potential authors just because I get so many of these things. And I will say there's no single one thing that might be a signal that this is like you said, I don't really like the term predatory necessarily because there's so much gray area, but perhaps an unethical journal or a less than ideal journal. And I will say part of the reason why this has come to my attention is that before I came to Nazareth, I actually worked internationally at New York University, Abu Dhabi. And one of the things I noticed when I started working there was that I received so much more direct marketing than I'd ever received when I was working in the United States. And the same was true for faculty that I worked with. And so they would often come and say, have you heard of this journal? And of course, I do my librarian thing. I look it up, get all the details. And oftentimes they were not the most ethical journals. So, and I will say, though, before I even get into some of these signals, that not all direct marketing to authors is bad. So last year, I did a poster presentation at the American Library Association conference, which is one of our bigger conferences within our field, and I did get direct marketing from a journal saying, oh, we liked your poster. Would you think about potentially turning this into a full-length article in this journal? And that's actually what you really want to do, ideally, is take some work that you've already done and perhaps think of other avenues or ways of expressing it, getting it out there. So I did my background research on the journal, and I did end up publishing with them. So these are some bad examples, but not all direct marketing is bad. And I will say, so the different hats that I wear, so I'm certainly an advisor to faculty who are thinking about publishing. I'm also a peer reviewer for several journals in the library science field. And I also consider myself a researcher practitioner. So obviously my day job is I'm a librarian, I'm a practicing librarian, but I also regularly do research projects, and so I have a number of publications under my belt. So with that in mind, some of the things that I like to look at, so I have 3 different slides. So this one of my favorite things to point out is the journal title. So can anybody think of any research that wouldn't fall under this purview of this journal? And that's just a rhetorical question. So it's worldwide, multidisciplinary research and development, and you'll see other examples that are even more broad than that. So it's hard to think, well, what kind of research wouldn't fit in this journal? So a really broad or generic title is generally not a good thing. You'll also notice the weird formatting. The image doesn't appear properly within the email, so that's maybe a bad sign. And also, right in the title, the subject of the email, it says free. So it's trying to present this to authors as a free option. Again, that's maybe not the most optimal way. Thanks. And this, again, will relate to what Amanda mentioned. So promise of quick publication, for those of you that can't see it, it says paper publication in 60 days, almost as if it's a guarantee that your publication will be out in 60 days. That's not probably the best signal that this is going to be a great journal for me. Unusual language, so it says if you have burst out some new ideas in your specialized or interested fields, et cetera, et cetera. So it just sounds a little off to me, sort of like, okay, who was copy editing this? Those might be some signals. And this one is my favorite too, inflated credentials. So I am not a doctor. I have never claimed to be one at any point in my life, but they might be trying to flatter me as a potential author by calling me a doctor. And also the wide variety of publishing options. So it says, we have a shortfall of articles, we would love a 2-page opinion or mini review. And then even lower it says, we could also publish as an iBook, ebook, or video. So all of these different options are again telling me, this looks a little fishy to me as a publication option. So in terms of finding a good fit, there are a number of different ways, and I apologize if I'm repeating some of the things that Amanda just mentioned, but I always like to think about what journals are you reading? So what are you actually reading? Because that might be something that's going to be a good fit with your research. It might be worth looking at their website to see what their instructions for authors are, and that should be a really robust page. It should have really good descriptions of the scope of the journal, and the scope of the journal should not be literally anything in the world, but something very specific to your field. And they will give good guidelines, and it will give you a good sense of what would be the process if you submitted your article to this journal. You also want to see where is this journal indexed, and that's sometime when you might want to talk to your librarian and say, okay, I was approached by this journal, or I saw this journal. What are some of the databases that we have where I could see a couple issues from it, or just to make sure that it's a legitimate journal. Let me see. And of course, there are multiple lists that rank journals, but a lot of us, I've noticed even in our conversation earlier today, have mixed feelings about the way in which journals are sometimes ranked. But in terms of getting ideas of journals in your field, it's not the worst place to go. And another thing that I find really helpful, just in terms of a practical tip as someone who publishes research, is to take advantage of Google Scholar. And you might not always hear librarians singing the praises of Google Scholar, but one thing that I really like about it is that it lets you build up your author profile. And so one of the things that you want to do as an emerging scholar in your field is get your name out there and have people be able to potentially Google you and see all the things that you've written. And so I was surprised even at New York University by how many faculty did not have a Google Scholar profile. Really well-known faculty who just said, oh, I haven't had time for that. But what it enables people to do is see you as an author, see everything that you've written in one place, and it really just helps get your name out there. And another thing that I like about it is that I can not only get an alert when people cite my articles, but it will also send me recommendations based on new articles being published in which the keywords match up with the things that I've published. So it lets me see, even if they haven't cited me, what are people publishing in my field. And so I get a lot of good ideas that way, and I get access to a couple new journal articles. And I will say, if you haven't already done so, setting up alerts in your library's databases to get alerts when new things are published in your field is an excellent thing to do. Again, just to see what are some of the trends within my fields? Do I have access to these things? And just see what people are talking about. And then one last point that I wanted to bring up, because I was talking with some faculty at Nazareth this week, and they said, please talk about community engaged scholarship. So this is something that has become really big on our campus. And for those of you that haven't heard this term before, community engaged scholarship is research in which researchers or professors, graduate students are engaged in research that somehow impacts their community and often involves working with community partners. And so you can think of community on a local level. You can also think of communities that perhaps are a little wider than that, potentially even international communities. And I really think that we're going to see a trend of more researchers looking into this and thinking about, okay, let's take our research out of the ivory tower, the intellectual bubble, and think about how we can really affect people in the real world. And so I promised my faculty members that I would make a point to mention that to you. And again, it is something I think of too, because most of my research is very practical based and trying to make sure that librarians, for example, are reaching our students most effectively. And then so I love to see faculty members trying to think about, okay, how can we do this research together, but also have a positive impact on our communities? Okay, thank you.
Afternoon. My name is Jim DelRosso. I do not have slides, and at some point, my name tag managed to fall off. So in many ways, it's like I'm not even here. I am a librarian at Cornell University. I am a repository manager there. I've been doing this for a while. I started working in repositories over 13 years ago, started managing my first repository almost 10 years ago now, and started managing my second repository simultaneously about 5 years ago. What that means is I put a lot of material online between those two repositories, something in the range of 33,000 objects, with a good percentage of that being from faculty publications or Center Institute publications, scholarly publications from within the colleges I serve. I've analyzed a lot of publisher policies. I provided a good amount of scholarly communication support, and I've looked at my fair share of contracts, both for myself and for faculty members who have asked me to go through and take a look at it and see what my advice might be. So that's going to inform a lot of what I say today. I actually want to start off with something of a caveat and a little bit of a soapbox. I am going to be the third person up here to mention that I don't usually use the term predatory publishing. My reasons are in some ways similar, but I also largely don't use the term because I feel that the less ethical, I like that term, the less ethical publishers to whom that terminology is usually ascribed, they don't rise to the level of predators. within the scholarly communication landscape. They're petty scammers. And they're, and the larger allegedly legitimate publishing industry, especially the larger houses such as Elsevier, Taylor Francis, Springer, those are incredibly predatory. They exploit free labor on the part of authors. They exploit free labor on the part of reviewers, and then they sell it back to university librarians at ever-increasing rates, rates that exceed inflation by a huge amount every year and make library budgets effectively unsustainable. So I consider calling the petty scammers predatory to be scaremongering and obfuscation. And I know that there are some folks, including some librarians, who like to pin the blame on them and say that they are the biggest crisis in scholarly communication. Calling them the big crisis in scholarly communication is like blaming the 2008 financial crisis on that dude who emailed you pretending to be a Nigerian prince. It's a small part of it. So what I'm going to talk about today is when you go through this process of publishing, what you can do to get the most out of it for yourself, for your rights, for your ability to use your own scholarship, and for your own scholarly legacy going forward. So I want to start by knowing your rights. Section 106 of the Copyright Act states that only the owner of a copyright has the authority to use the work in one of 6 ways: to reproduce the work, to prepare derivative works based upon the work, to distribute copies of the work, to publicly perform the work, to publicly display the work, and to publicly perform sound recordings via a digital audio transmission. Now, these rights can be limited by statute, there's a library exception, there's fair use, or they can be limited by contract. And the latter one is important to this discussion because when you sign on with a publisher to publish your work, they're going to try to, it is going to be a request to transfer your copyright. In fact, many of these agreements say right at the top, transfer of copyright agreement. So right off the bat, always read your contract. Always. Always read it before signing. And these days, when a lot of submission process takes place online through the website, they're trying more and more to make it look like the Apple terms and conditions so that you just scroll through and have to click to make things go. Please still read it. And if I'm being honest, we should do that with Apple too, but I'm in no position to throw stones on that one, so I'm just going to move on. So take a look and actually read your contract. See what's in there. If you're not sure about it, go talk to folks in your library. Talk to the folks in your library who work with scholarly communication. Talk to the folks who work with copyright. Ask them what's going on in the contract. Ask them what you might want to be concerned about. Usually, the contract is going to ask you to be turning over those rights that are associated with copyright, often by just turning over copyright entirely to the publisher. One thing that I've noticed looking at contracts the last several years is there's more savviness involved. Something that I'm seeing a lot of is you'll look at a journal and you'll do what I do, which is, well, who owns copyright on these articles? Oh, they all say copyright by the author. That's good. And then you look at the contract, and the contract doesn't say anything about copyright transfer. What it says is that you are licensing a list of rights. You may recognize them from what I listed earlier, all the rights associated with copyright, to the publisher in perpetuity and exclusively. And they will usually say something, if anything else is ever associated with copyright by US law, you're signing that over too. It's brilliant. I was really impressed by this because basically copyright is a basket of rights. They are taking everything in the basket and handing you back the empty basket. And then they get to say copyright by the author, even though they still have all of those rights. I will also say, and while I am admittedly and right up front, I'm an OA advocate, don't think that just because something is open access, you shouldn't read the contract either. You need to go through and read that because often just because something is released open access, put up on somebody's website, that doesn't mean you can necessarily do everything with that you want to. I had an author come to me about one of the repositories say, we paid $3,000. Put this in the repository. And I looked at the rights and I looked at everything else. I'm like, I can't do that. You do not have the right to put this up. I don't have the right to put this up. They have the right to put it up. They have all the rights and they are making it freely available. It is open access, but you cannot do all of these things you actually want to do with your work. So read the contract no matter what. And know your options. There are a number of options. Spark has an addendum. There are a number of addendums you can do to try to negotiate the contract, get rights put back into the contract that aren't initially there. There's a database called Sherpa Romeo. This is when I'm really wishing I'd made a slide. I apologize. That actually does list the policies for different publishers. You can see, even if you do sign the agreement, you put all your rights in, you give them those rights, what do they generally allow you to do? Can you put it in a repository? Can you put it on your own website? I will note that this is usually the best effort of the people who maintain Sherpa Romeo to keep it up to date, but it may not match what's on their website, and it may not match what's actually in the contract they give you. This is a personal experience. Me and a co-author were publishing a journal in a non-library journal, in a labor studies journal, in fact, and we chose it on the basis of what was on their website, on what was in Sherpa Romeo. I'm like, this is great. We can put up the post-print into our repository with no embargo. They sent us the contract, and of course I read it, and I'm like, hey, this says an 18-month embargo. And I checked Sherpa Romeo, I checked the website, they still said no embargo, and so we negotiated. And luckily, the editor didn't seem to feel like they had a particular dog in that fight and said, no, it's okay, you can put that up. And I'm like, I have that in writing, we're gonna just go with that. But read the contracts, because they might, even if you do the research in advance, what you actually get in a contract may not match that. And as always, and if you're getting frustrated, look for other publishing options that may be more amenable to keeping your rights. Look for places that are upfront, as some of the folks who have already talked about allowing you to have more freedom with your work. But do understand that may mean going outside of traditional legacy publishing, and there are definitely costs associated with that. But the main thing out there is know your rights, read your contract, and talk to your librarians, because we can absolutely help. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Maggie Kearney from the University of Rochester. I'm happy to be here, and I'm the only kind of faculty person on this panel, and my remarks are directed at authors, particularly new authors who or mentors who want to guide new authors on finding a scholarly journal that might work for your paper. So, journals and book publishers, as you've heard a lot of already, actually vary quite a bit. And starting with who owns them. Scholarly journals may be owned by the scholarly association. They're often started by scholars in an association, or they may be owned by a publisher or by a corporation, and they all have a different agenda. So it's actually instructive to know who owns a given journal. Each journal and review panel and kind of the people surrounding a given journal has its own culture and tradition, and we need, who's our anthropologist here? Amanda? No, Ilka, to tell us about recognizing a culture. And newer journals are a little harder to appraise in terms of what their agenda is, whether it's correctly stated on their aims and scope or not, and what they value and what they're not interested in. And the more mature journals, shall we say, are easier to assess in terms of their culture, but not always as forward-thinking as you might like. Even within a field, journals have different audiences. For example, in a clinically oriented field like mine in nursing, there are journals that are pure research. That's the kind of journal I edited. A nurse in Strong Memorial Hospital would have no interest in my journal because it's content that's designed for people seeking building blocks for other research. Other journals are targeted for more faculty educating clinicians, and some journals are targeted to the frontline people. So new authors need to learn to recognize the audience of a given journal. So how does a journal develop a track record that a newer author could then judge? So the way it starts is the editor really has a lot of influence over the direction of the journal, and the editor traditionally recruits or replaces members on an editorial board and solicits and selects reviewers. So there's a lot of power and responsibility there. So look and see who's the editor, what discipline are they from, what do you know about them? And each discipline has a tradition in how publishers and journals operate. In the biomedical world, it's very different from sociology or anthropology, for example. And don't ask me about creative arts, because that's got to be very different. The topics that journals publish are obviously different, but also they differ in what types of research methods are considered strong enough versus weak or suspect. And the expectations of the reviewers, the peer reviewers for that journal, how much time they have to do a review, apparently whether they get paid or not, and what they expect to have in the comments that reviewers send back can vary quite a bit. And if you're thinking of becoming a peer reviewer, or you are one already, you may have recognized this. You can get guidance, and sometimes there are little tutorials available for what's looked for in a peer review. The practice of blinding, whether in most cases the author does not know who the reviewers are, but in some cases the reviewer also doesn't know who the author is, and that's a double-blinded arrangement. And in different disciplines, they have different expectations for whether peer review is single-blinded or double-blinded. And there's a track record that develops over time that senior people in your field will be able to tell you about immediately. Oh, that journal, they only like, huge samples with heavy statistics. Or that journal's audience is really for people in this subdiscipline and the like. Journal reputation is also, as we've heard, fueled by things like rankings. And in my world, the biomedical world, it's the impact factor, the JCR impact factor, which is based on the percentage of your articles that are cited, actually the average citations per article. And so to create that number, they need several years of data. So the newest journals don't have rankings. And as an indicator, you can manipulate a ranking easily if you're an editor or a publisher, but at least being on the list of ranked journals is an indicator of a little bit of a vetting process and some longevity. And then there's indexing, as you already heard. People can't find your work if it's not in an established index in your discipline. And there are some sort of fake indexes or upstart imitation indexes that have arisen as a result of some sort of questionable publishers. So you may see in one of these, I'll use the term predatory communications, that our journal is ranked X, Y, and Z on an index, and they'll give you some initials, and you look up this index, and it really is not the one it's imitating. So again, go for the reputable sources. So I'll join the club and talk about open access and predatory publishing, and I agree there's a spectrum of obnoxiousness in predatory publishing, and certainly traditional publishers have predatory practices as well, which I have pushed back against as an editor in a for-profit publisher environment. So obviously open access means, we hope, free to readers. But then, as you know, journals are not only also subscription only, but can be a hybrid model where you as an author can pay a fee to make your article open access while the other articles in that issue or volume may not be. And you may or may not have a good reason to do that. Be aware that author fees can really run to big numbers, up to $5,000. This kind of escalation was fueled by the fact that in the biomedical world, researchers were writing publication fees into their grants, and and they really were able to afford higher and higher fees. So open access is not a quality indicator. It's just a way of distributing content, as you've heard. And I second the vote to look at indexes of reputable and vetted open access journals. There's a directory of open access journals. There's the Open Access Scholarly Publishing Association as places to start. And then here's what I mean by predatory journals. And this is the fly-by-night variety. So here's your predatory publisher, Mr. Burns, and his goal is to make money. And open access without quality is what we've been talking about today in terms of predation. Submissions are solicited with flattering emails, such as the ones you saw. There's often an impressive imitation of a journal name and a journal logo to resemble that prestigious journal you thought you just got an email from. And the differences can be quite subtle. And then you look at the URL or the email sender address and you see, oh, this comes from somewhere in Southeast Asia and not necessarily that publisher that I thought. Sometimes editors and board members are listed by pulling their names and photos off the web without the awareness of those folks. Rapid review is promised. Acceptance is actually almost guaranteed. 48-hour turnaround is not uncommon in a journal of this sort. Sometimes they don't really tell you about author fees until after you submit your work and it's in their hands. I had a colleague who paid a fee, was shocked to discover that this fee was due, was able to negotiate it down. Now that's not a good sign. And then when the journal was outed by some challengers who were more powerful than my colleague, it disappeared from the web and her work was gone. And she said, well, what about my copyright, et cetera, et cetera. So there are true predators out there, and then there are the gray zones. So if you're a newer author, protect your work and stick with a tried and true. So how does a reputable journal add value to your work? First of all, the quality rests in editorial standards and a rigorous peer review process. Now, typically, as published authors among us know, the peer review process starts with a screening. If it's a commercial publisher, that's usually done by journal staff to see does this meet our basic expectations? It's then assigned to an editor. And the editor, some journals get thousands of submissions a year, often has the option to do what editors call a desk reject, meaning this is not going out to reviewers and using anybody else's time because it has no chance of success. These are the decision letters you get in less than 2 weeks after you submit your hard-earned work, and they explain, we're saving you time and our journal reviewers time because this paper is not going to succeed in our peer review process. As an editor, I would always write a reason, but that's what that means when you get a fast rejection like that. When a paper goes out for review, the duration of the wait time for you as author can range from weeks to months based on journal traditions, disciplinary traditions. And typically in scientific fields, it should be less than 3 months, but that may vary again from field to field. The journal should publish the average turnaround time to first decision and then to publication. And if a paper is accepted, the acceptance email should tell you how long you can expect to wait before that work appears, either online or in print or both. Now, how do reviewers influence the outcome of a paper? Reviews are not votes. Reviews are expert opinions, like they're your team of consultants. And then the editor makes the final decision. And the editor may or may not have an agenda that influences how those reviews are interpreted. So just if you get a paper back and it's rejected, but you think those reviews look really positive, hopefully the editor has given you some additional reason for the decision, because they do add a layer of judgment. Once a work is accepted, the formatting, copy editing, sometimes organizational redoing, and proofreading by the publisher really do add value. And there have been studies that show that the technically edited paper is better understood and better received by reviewers and more cited than the acceptance version. So that is something, as you're looking for a journal, that you want to think about. Some open access journals have more staff than others. So what you have to face as a newer author is the established journals really do shape the record of scholarship in your field. And so if you're a newer author, you may want to say, okay, what is out there where I could publish that is valued by my peers and is a known entity. The disadvantage is that change in expectations in established journals can be slow. Editors don't turn over every day. Review panels don't turn over very fast. And if you're doing a new type of research that could really make a difference in your discipline, and you hear back from the reviewers that, well, you know, this isn't something we ordinarily see, that may be a disadvantage of going with an established journal, but most editors are diligent to get expertise on board to support the most current research. The advantage of a really tough review process is it keeps you from being embarrassed later. And we have some local stories that we could hear about that. You do not want to be retracting your article because you discovered a big error or somebody calls you on a maybe less than straightforward presentation of your work. You also protect the public from acting on the basis of unfounded conclusions. So peer review protects the public, and it also protects you as an author. You kind of need their help. So if you're going to be choosing a journal, get really diligent about getting to know the journals in your field. The title may not tell you what you need to know. I had a student who did a really elegant qualitative ethnographic study in Jamaica about what it's like to be a gay man in Jamaica where homosexuality is illegal. And he said, oh, look, here's a journal, AIDS and Behavior. This looks so perfect for my topic. Well, they only publish large sample quantitative studies with sophisticated statistics. And I said, no. When we've looked at the content, we can tell that this isn't going to work for you. Oh, look, here's a journal that's maybe less well-known, but well-established and publishes, small, intricate qualitative work. So we were able to redirect his submission. So you got to read the content. What's in there that's your kind of study? You got to read the aims and scope, as was mentioned. See if you know the editors, look them up, look at tables of contents, read abstracts, get a sense of the target audience of that journal, and have several lined up. And so you tailor your paper to your first choice journal, follow the author guidelines scrupulously. The bigger the journal, the more likely it is that they'll just turn back the paper if you don't follow the author guidelines. Get an internal review first. And so what you do is get your senior mentor to read the paper for its significance, its message, the flow of the information, and the fit of the journal. And then get your picky, what do I want to say, OCD friend to check it for typos. You can't see your own typos. It's just genetically impossible somehow. So then you submit your paper. There's no point in harboring it and reading it over and over again. Just jump over that cliff. Allow time and patience for the online submission process. Most traditional publishers use one of these huge software packages such as Editorial Manager or Scholar One, which have many, many steps involved in uploading the pieces of your paper and retyping its title and all your author identification. Allow a lot of time. This is not something you do like an hour before a deadline. Decision wait, as we said, can be from days to months, and hopefully they've told you that ahead of time. Try not to bug the editor until it's well beyond the published average turnaround time. You can be sure that the editors want as much as you do for the process to be prompt. But you can sometimes get an update or a projected decision time if it's beyond the limit. When you get the decision back, if you get the option to revise and resubmit, this is a really good answer. I've had new authors say to me, well, I didn't even try because I could tell they didn't like it. This is, when you think that in most journals in my area at least, 60 to 80% of papers are rejected. To have the option to revise and resubmit it is really good news, so do it. And if it's rejected, you got feedback. You can use that. Make the revisions, even though it's not going back to that journal. If these are actually good points, once you've let the reviews sit, in your inbox for a few days after so you can sort of get unemotional about it. Once you start going through the list of requested revisions, they're probably not that bad. Make them and then go into the formatting and conversion for your next journal. So this is kind of what we owe to the public that helped us get our degrees, that supported our grants. So do publish your work, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. Oh, important things. I think we brought up a lot of really interesting topics in those conversations. Now, there are a couple of microphones. Nick is walking them around. Who has some questions that they would like to pose to our panel here? So, I think up in front here, we've got a couple.
So you were just talking about revise and resubmit process. So I'm wondering about the difference between that and accepted with revision.
Okay. Revise and resubmit means they haven't accepted it yet, but they're very interested in the paper and they want you to revise it because there is a possibility of publication. It's probably a pretty good possibility, or they wouldn't burden themselves with seeing your paper again. Accepted with revisions is just what it sounds like, and that's wonderful news. And that means if you can make the changes that are requested to their satisfaction, you're set. The paper is accepted. So that second kind of decision is even better than the first.
Thanks for the presentations. So I can imagine a wish list of things here, right? From some sort of amazing reputation, open access, free or cheap to get your work up there. Your tenure committee knows the work well, that kind of stuff. Which of those is going to be most important, or what else am I missing?
Well, I'll jump in and hope that my colleagues will too. There's for the good of society, and that's where you pick the best possible journal. And then there's for the good of you, which is getting promotion and tenure. As a so-called junior faculty member, take care of yourself first, but balance that with choosing the best possible venue for the wider world to see your work. So you're doing a balancing act between choosing a journal that is really forward-looking in getting its content out to all corners of the globe without restriction, and a journal that is known and respected by your peers. So there are journals that are both.
I would second that. There are journals that are both and meet your personal motivations and ethics, but also the needs of a research and tenure process. But that is speaking to open access and publication through journal presses and publication methods. Sometimes the answer isn't to publish in an open access gold journal, it's to publish in the best industry standard that's a traditional journal, and you do read the contract or the publication agreement and sometimes have to sign over that copyright, but it is the best for your career. But then in the contract, you get self-archiving rights or some level of rights under copyright, and while you may lose the full copyright, you still have access and rights under copyright to distribute your work in some ways through repositories like RIT Scholar Works or disciplinary repositories. So then you can meet the needs of your research and tenure process, matching their high standard, well thought of journals, but also have open access.
Hi, we mentioned the double-blind peer review process and the ways that that could be beneficial. But I'm interested in the panel's thoughts about the opposite end of the spectrum, something I'm just calling double open. I see it in the BMC family. BMC Palliative Care is one of my favorites, where all of the reviewers' comments plus the author's responses are posted along with the published piece.
Well, I'll jump in. In some of those models, the reviewers sign the reviews. In others, they don't. If they don't, it's still a somewhat blinded process. But you can learn a lot by looking online at those published reviews to understand what those reviewers are looking for, what they're thinking. I would love us to get to a place where everybody had the confidence and integrity to treat each other's identities well. There have been examples of retaliation or bias in the review process if you don't think much of this author team or they're competing with you. You've been picked to review this paper because this is your area, and this paper is coming from the other top, research team in your area. It's really hard to be open-minded and positive about that paper. So that's the disadvantage of knowing who the authors are. The advantage of knowing who the authors are is that you as a reviewer can appreciate the geography. Is this from a rural place without much resources? Is this from a big city center? How does that shape my opinion of what they did and how they did it? The advantage of knowing who the reviewers are is it keeps the reviewers honest. In the experiments that, for example, BMJ did when they started making reviewers known, they found that the review quality was better because the reviewers edited out their nasty snipes and inappropriate adjectives that were just sort of showing off. Reviewers do sometimes show off. Well, of course, you should know that this procedure has been out of date for decades. That could be said differently. And so reviewers are more polite and generally more thoughtful when their identity is known. So there are really good things about open reviews, but over time, people have become concerned about risks as well.
Yeah, the only thing I would say to that it's a really fascinating concept, and for a long time, I spent a lot of time as a very, pro-transparency in all ways, but I became more and more aware that a lot of that feeling was because there were potential downsides to transparency, that because of who I am and what identities I have, I'm largely insulated from. And anytime you put out something like that where you move from anonymity to this kind of transparency, there are dynamics of power, dynamics of privilege that can come into play, and that has to be considered really seriously. And it could go in the way that you have a very prestigious reviewer and a not prestigious author, or vice versa. And there's a lot of stuff that can come out in either way. And if that's put out there, I think it's something that peer review needs to the culture around peer review needs to engage with anyway. Whether putting everything out there and completely openly is the way to engage with it, I'm not sure, and I think there could potentially be some harm to folks who have a little less power.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, in an idealized world, we would definitely do that. And I will say, even when you're first starting out, peer review can seem like this black box. And, unless you know the right people at the right journals, you can feel very excluded. So still thinking about hierarchies of power, you can also think of it from the other end. Like, if we could be more open, I think that would open up more scholarly publishing to people that have previously felt sort of excluded from that area.
I have two questions. I don't know if I can do both. One is about a new technique for those less reputable or unethical journals, which is the practice of buying a traditional journal that has been on a rundown because we have so many journals. Sometimes a traditional journal kind of goes into decline a little bit or some ways. So publishers that buy those traditional known names and continue publishing, and to the authors, they look the same, but they change the editorial practices completely. And those are very difficult to spot on, because if you go based on your history. So if you have any comments about, yes, or not about those practices, I learned that this is something that is happening. So I'm worried about that. The second question is about, in relation to peer review. I know, because of my professors have been telling me, that it's more and more difficult to find people to do reviews, because it's very time consuming, it's not very well acknowledged in some ways. So people, they are avoiding. For editors, they have a hard time sometimes finding reviewers. And there is new initiatives like Pablons, where you try to put metrics and make it very open, your work, to recognize your work as a reviewer. So what do you think about those initiatives?
Okay.
Thank you.
I have a couple short answers to both, and then I'll let my colleagues pitch in. So to the practice that sometimes big box or large-scale publishers buy smaller journals that are in decline or maybe have plateaued, that are traditional or conventional publications requiring publication contracts, so not open access publications. This does happen, and one thing I'd say, I don't know that there's anything the industry can do about it except try to be cognizant of it and embed it into your research that you're doing when you're evaluating, do I want to publish in X or Y journal? And also, if you've published in a journal from years past and you say, you know what, I want to embed this work that I did 2-3 years ago, revisit just to double check that all the rights that you once had are still applicable as they should be according to the original publication contract that you signed. But I think that applies to what you're saying, because if a journal is bought by one, sometimes the rights of copyright move from one LLC or corporation to another. So it's just something to be cognizant of. In terms of your question on reviewers, I have noticed that there is some conversation in academic circles about trying to credit people who are reviewers in the research and tenure process or promotion package, even if you're not part of a tenure cycle, just as part of our work, just like posters, conferences, publications, all of the other things we do. But you're right that it's not often accredited. So I don't know of any actual universities that do recognize review as a valuable contribution, but I have heard conversations that it should be.
I mostly have comments on the first question about the sale, and agreeing with everything that was just said. Also, I think it's another really good reason to, when you're publishing, try to lock down your ability to do the things you're going to want to do with your works later, and keeping copies for yourself as well, in case things do get weird in terms of sales and resales and things change. If you have something you can point to and say, no, look, I have the clear ability to do what I need to do with this, you're going to be in a better position. And I will say this is a time-honored problem. One of the first things I had to do working in repositories was trying to put up a paper that was published in the early 70s, and the journal went defunct in the mid-70s. It was sold several more times that I traced through the sales of these journal and the copyright, and the trail petered out in the mid-80s. And I could not determine who, if anyone, owned the copyright. So I put it up about 11 years ago now, and no one's asked me to take it down, so it's probably okay. It's a gray area. It's very much an orphan work, but that was a situation where the copyright was transferred, it moved from place to place, but it never came back to the author, and the author was someone who was an emeritus faculty wanting me to put that stuff up now. So it's another good reason to lock down your ability to do what you want with the material.
In terms of looking at how a journal changes over time when ownership changes, as a reader, I can tell a decline in the quality of the content. That may be a little more esoteric, but the point about knowing the agreement you originally signed is really important. Authors should save these. And because you could need them for all kinds of reasons. Can you post your stuff on ResearchGate or LinkedIn or the like? Can you include published work in your dissertation? All these depend on the nature of the agreement that you signed with the journal, so definitely keep them. In terms of the workload of peer review, it is not inconsiderable, and as chair of a promotion and tenure committee, we absolutely take reviewing into consideration. It's not as important as publishing, but it should be there. It's part of your service to your scholarly discipline. And tenure review is usually based on research, teaching, and service, and that's a form of service. Publons is a handy way of keeping track of your reviews. You sign up, and then if the journal belongs, you can just click a link that says, yes, add this to my Publons listing. Now, what you don't do as a reviewer is list the titles or journals, the titles of papers that you've reviewed in your CV or tenure package, because your identity was supposed to be blinded. But you can list the journals you've reviewed for. And this is a good track record. I, as editor, have even written letters in support of promotion and tenure based on reviews people have done. The workload of reviewing is outrageous. It would take me generally 9 to 12 invitations to get 3 acceptances for a given paper. Despite my customizing my request. Please, I really need your expertise on this. I was so glad to see you at this conference last year, all this personal stuff. But people are busy, and it's very easy to turn down a review by clicking a link saying, can't do it. in comparison to the old days when you got a hard copy in the mail and there it was sitting on your desk and somebody was waiting to hear from you. One can reduce the workload. It gets faster over time, although it shouldn't be too fast. And by knowing what the editor actually expects, and for myself as editor, I wanted to know, is there a fatal flaw in this paper? And are there lesser weaknesses? If so, give me like bullet points in order of importance. Don't tell me about writing other than to maybe mention this needs copy editing or English editing. Just give me the main points so that the actual write-up of the review at least doesn't have to take so much time. The preparation, reading, thinking, and often checking sources inevitably does take time, though. It is a significant issue. And I hope that as scholars in the room, you'll say yes to the right invitations to review and ask your mentors, if you're on the newer side, how many to say yes to, which ones to say yes or no to. Also, if you're on the faculty and you'd like to involve a student in a review, make sure you ask the editor before you take that step, because there's intellectual property involved and the student needs to know the restrictions on that. Good question.
And I'll just add one more little thing to that, which is that I love being a peer reviewer. So to anybody who gets a chance to do it, it's an excellent way of keeping abreast of what's going on in your field. And I get a thank you email from editors like once a year, just sort of checking in, making sure that I still want to do it, and I say yes, and then they send me a thank you, which I save. So I save that in a folder, like tenure folder, so I'm making sure that when the time comes, I'll be ready to present that as part of my service.
With these epic systems now for storing reviews and manuscripts, I can pull up not only how I rated those reviews, which ordinarily the author may or may not get back, but the reviews themselves. And when I write a letter to support somebody for promotion and tenure, I can say, in a paper about X, this reviewer astutely noticed this key point, and I really appreciated it as an editor. And I have probably, before I went and found it, completely forgotten about that whole review process. So often editors can save and retrieve just mountains of information about the review process and the reviewers. So there are ways of getting a customized letter of appreciation and support.
I have a couple questions. The first one is about exceptions. You know, if we're writing for two different special issues from the same journal, if they happen to have two special issues that fit my work. So I'm wondering about, because I'm so new to publishing, special issues consecutively, is that appropriate? And then secondly, we've talked before about predatory publishing and talking about journals, but I'm wondering about emails from publishers. I got an email recently about a collection, and I looked up the publisher. I'd never heard of them before. It seemed a little bit suspect, so I wasn't sure. Is that something that we could meet with a librarian about and ask questions and opinions, or maybe forward the email to someone? And asking just what do you think about this publisher or this entity?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's one of the services that Ilka was mentioning is really great to use your librarians for. I think it's great, and I applaud you for doing the research yourself firsthand. So thank you for doing that. I would go to the librarians if you're affiliated with RIT, Francis, or the others here. I think would be glad to help you. In a resource that might be useful is Think, Check, Submit. And I have some other resources that are embedded in the last slide under reading materials. But the other point to your question about being an author that submits to different special issues within a journal, I personally don't see that as an issue. If you have different publications or even the same one, and it meets the author submission guidelines to two separate special collections, why not?
I agree. If it's a reputable journal, then you're just lucky. If they have a place for two of your papers, absolutely. A publication is a publication as people evaluate your work.
So a couple people had mentioned article processing charges, and there was some mention of how they've crept up because big R1s have grants to write for them. Coming from St. John Fisher College, just right down the road, we feel that tension often because we're not part of those big grants with dissemination pieces. But what do you think as a panel would be an acceptable APC? I've been hearing from large families that families, meaning publisher families, the flagship journal has a high APC, which floats the newer fledgling journals, so they're trying to make it a feel-good process. I've been following PLOS Biology for years, and their APC has doubled in the last 8 years. And so when I talk with students, we talk about, does it really take $3,000 per article to make a journal run? And what does that money do? And how does that all work? So what do you all feel is an acceptable APC?
Great question.
I'm going to let my colleagues speak, but I think it varies from discipline to discipline. I'm in the camp where if we can foster open access through green open access and the publication contract, self-archiving rights is highly beneficial. However, I'd also say that if there are library collections budgets that support the subscription and membership model versus the article processing charge model, that means that the economics for the fees sometimes can at least be deferred to some degree by the institution instead of the individual.
I personally think as a newer scholar, one should not pay out of one's own pocket more than a couple $100. It makes perfect sense if money is a concern to go with a traditional publishing model in a journal that's large enough that most people have access to it through an index or through an institutional subscription. The inflation is bad. What do you get for that money? You hope you get really professional and intense polishing of your work, worldwide marketing, some really impressive in-house. Often there's an in-house statistical editor and other staff in the larger publishing operations. And if you don't find out that that's there, don't pay that money. Find a different outlet for your work.
Who's going to sneak in here with a question real quick? Several of you guys on the panel have mentioned green and gold open access a little bit. Could you guys sort of define that? I'm not sure everyone in the audience understands what we mean by those terms and how that impacts things.
So green and gold open access are two of the broader categories, and I always think of it in terms of how the work is born. So gold open access is usually published in open access journals, which means it's open access from the moment of publication. And the version of record is available open access. Green open access, as Amanda said, is usually done through repositories like the ones that are managed by a lot of librarians, including some of us up here. That means that the version that is published first is not necessarily open access. But there's another, but through license agreements or negotiations, et cetera, a version of the article is made available through a repository, but it's not out of an open access journal. So gold is usually, with all of these, it's always usually, open access journals, open access from the moment of publication. Green is through repositories, either institutional repositories or disciplinary repositories, not always the exact same version that's published, and not, for lack of a better terminology, the original publication. Is that?
Yeah, no, I would only add that the green open access, it varies from publisher to publisher on what kind of rights to what version. So you have 3 different versions generally. You have the preprint, which is the very first one. You have the author final version, which is also called a postprint. That's post peer review, and in many disciplines, but not all exactly the same thing, except it doesn't have color and fancy gloss, to the version of record. And the version of record is the final last version that ends up in the publication itself. So depending on your discipline, the version of record and the postprint, also known as the author final version, may be very much the same type of content.
My question is, many times authors can take the fee, yes, the article processing charges from their grants, but many times they need to justify, yes, why. And if you can share some good justifications to the granting agencies of why you want to publish open access. I have one of my own that actually a professor mentioned it a few weeks ago. And he says that he justifies as helping with the replicability of his own study. So if I make it open access, a lot of people will have access, and it will be easy to replicate and continue. So that's a good one, if you haven't heard that. But do you have any other arguments that you could use with granting agencies to justify the cost?
Well, if it's NIH or NSF and the grant comes from our tax dollars, they're obliged to get those findings to the public. Now, the way NIH handles it is through PubMed Central, and the traditional publishers will send the accepted version, not the technically edited and polished version, but the accepted version to the federal repository, and it should be available. They say within 6 months. In reality, the actual NIH process is so slow that it takes longer than that. So that argument sometimes gets pushed back at, well, it's going to be publicly available whether or not you pay open access charges. It's just, it may not be the pretty version. But I think the rationale, if it's rooted in the science that the work comes from, like this is the journal that will establish us as primary in the field. This is what our people read so that we can contribute to building this line of research, and this journal is Public Library of Science, or a highly reputable and expensive open access journal, then that might be an angle to try.
Yeah, I think it's really about the impact that your article can have within the world of academia. It's going to be so much more robust if it's available to everyone. And we can also think of the international scholars. You know, I think of this because I worked internationally, but there are people in many countries that are struggling to get access to high quality scientific or other literature. And so they would also like to publish, and they would like to cite articles, but sometimes they don't have access. So open access is really a great way of spreading knowledge, but also increasing the impact of your work.
I would only add that there are times where these works really apply to that community engagement that was spoken of earlier, and that's applicable to the international, but also to our local US-based communities that might not have all the public health resources that some of us are lucky to have. So I would second everything that everyone has said to this question so far, but also say that sometimes you can really get to the heart depending on what your research is, both to the international but to the local communities we have here, because that's who the audience is.
Any additional questions? All right, well, it's 3:25, and so I think we're allowed to be done and eat some food. I want to thank all of our panelists very much for joining us today. I've enjoyed this conversation very much. And I'm hoping that you will stick around, and I'm hoping that these guys will stick around for some further conversations. I can smell those brownies from where I was standing over there. They smell very good. So go ahead and help yourselves to some food. Thank you very much for coming.